Hello and welcome to the Agrileader podcast from IFC's Agribusiness Leadership Program. I'm your host, Lily Kubala, and I'm here to take you inside ALP for a deeper look at our work, the people leading it, and the impact it's having. Today, we're discussing gender inclusion, why it's good for business, and how we can do it better. To speak on this, I'm joined by Lydia Mbevi, who works on gender inclusion for ALP. Lydia, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Lily, for having me.
So before we dive in, could you tell us a bit about your role at ALP?
So I'm part of the team that looks at investments in Africa and tries to see what do those businesses need in order to succeed and thrive in different countries in Africa. And one of the things we look at is smallholder farmers, cooperatives around their structures and systems in whatever countries they're in, and how those systems can enable them plug into different agribusiness investments. So my role is to support those investment processes.
So in that context, when we throw around the term gender inclusion, what does that mean?
So honestly, the biggest misconception is this is about being nice or being politically correct. But in reality, it's about how well a business actually functions. So in many agribusinesses across Africa, you'll be surprised to know that women already make up 30 to 60% of the workforce. And so they're a large part of the shareholders. But systems, and by systems I mean procurement, extension services, digital platforms, those are usually designed around the people who are most visible. And that's where the disconnect happens, because those who are most visible are often men or often people in urban settings. So when companies think they're reaching everyone, they're really not. And when you don't reach everyone, then the supply chain is broken. It affects loyalty, productivity, and it becomes inefficient. So what we've seen is that if women farmers had the same access to resources, productive resources as men, farm yields would increase by up to 30%. So this is not a social issue or a nice to have. This is actually good business sense.
30% is just such a wide margin. And I think this is something that I notice a lot working at ALP, that our goals seem sort of altruistic, where they're really business smart. And on that point, can you dive in a little bit more on where inclusion or lack of inclusion really affects that business performance and that bottom line?
So if you design for only one type of user, everyone else becomes an afterthought. Let's use digital platforms as an example. I've seen those rolled out to smallholder farmers where onboarding happens using smartphones, it happens in English, it happens in the evening, training sessions are in the evening. That excludes a huge segment of the population, particularly rural women. Many of them share phones. Many of them in the evening is their busiest time. They have lower literacy rates. So those types of things, when they're overlooked, then companies try and fix this later, and that becomes very expensive. So when you design from the very beginning with all your users in mind, whether it's women, youth, rural farmers, lower literacy groups, then it makes a design that's sustainable, realistic, and something that can have meaningful impact. So good designs include everyone by default. Bad designs exclude people by accident.
So as we're talking here, I find myself thinking about this story that you've told before that encapsulate a lot of these visibility issues. Could you tell our audience a little about the truck that didn't stop?
Yeah, so that's one of my most memorable stories in the 20 years I've been doing this work. So a company invested heavily in an outgrower model where collection trucks went out weekly to buy produce. And on paper, everything looked very efficient. But when we went out to the field, we found villages full of productive farmers, mostly women, whose produce was not being collected. Not because they weren't producing, but because they weren't registered in the outgrower model. They weren't on the aggregator's list. They were not in the system. And the company didn't realize they were missing. And that's almost half of the population that was producing in that area. So what struck me the most is that they didn't have malicious intent. The managers weren't anti-women or they weren't trying to exclude anyone. They just were not designing for those who were invisible. They worked with those who are easiest to engage with, and that's how bias often works in real life. And I've seen versions of this across Africa, sadly, in horticulture, cocoa, poultry, cotton, you name it. Once companies disaggregate their supplier data and physically map who's producing, then they often discover that they have left out this huge population, and it changes everything.
It is wild to me that happens, that you have so much supply and so many people waiting there to sell their crops. So walk me through, how does that happen? What are the systemic issues that are at play behind that story?
Yeah. So what this story shows is that exclusion is not personal. Systems tend to rely on existing power structures. So male community leaders in a lot of these villages, established cooperatives that are then, of course, based on our culture and social frameworks. Literate farmers are the ones who would be given those positions of leadership. People with assets are the ones who would be considered. That automatically sidelines women and youth and ethnic communities and poorer households. So that's what I mean by systematic. Once a system is built that way, then your data, your dashboards, your key performance indicators, the exclusion becomes self-reinforcing. You only see who's visible. So you design more for those you can see. And the invisible remain invisible. So data doesn't just measure reality, it reflects the biases that the system has.
It reflects the biases that the system has. That is so big and important. And how are we seeing these existing models unintentionally, not personally, amplifying exclusion, even when that's not the goal?
Yeah, so we see this in different ways. When companies fail to reach women farmers or workers, the impacts are tangible, less reliable supply chain, higher side selling because of the needs that the family has and the woman needs to put food on the table. So side selling, lower loyalty, higher turnover, weaker community trust. So I've seen clients improve repayment rates simply by ensuring women were directly registered instead of being invisible behind male household heads. So the women are also being paid. They're on the list to be paid when the product is sold. I've seen productivity improve when women receive training directly instead of secondhand through their spouses. So inclusion improves stability. And for agribusiness, stability is everything, especially when we have other problems that are beyond our control, like climate volatility and market shocks. What we can control, we really should do something about. Supply chains that only work for some people are fragile. Supply chains that work for everyone are resilient.
What is it that makes stability so important in these supply chains?
There are many factors that are beyond our control, particularly for agriculture. But when we have factors we can control, like what training is happening, who's going to attend, what time is it going to be held, what language will it, those kind of very intentional things help the users get the information they need, put it into practice, then that really stabilizes the supply chain. So they're able to provide the quality and quantity that the client needs. And I've seen it in coffee, for example, when it was mostly men who were being coached, then they go back, try and explain what they've learned. Broken telephone happens. But when we started training both men and women in that coffee project, production was just phenomenal. And the quality that the client got for their coffee was so good that became one of model projects.
We've talked a lot about that amplification of exclusion. And so how do we do the opposite? How do we amplify inclusion?
Yeah. So this is one of the most important points, because in most of the companies I work with, exclusion is almost never intentional. It's actually the result of design choices that are just neutral, not thinking through, not going beyond the surface. For example, if aggregators are selected based on who already has networks and assets, that tends to be older men. Training is scheduled during hours that work for full-time farmers, but not for women who are juggling all these responsibilities and roles. Registration requires a formal ID. That sounds like such a simple thing, but you'd be surprised how many millions of women don't have a formal ID. They don't have land titles that are in their name. They don't have a smartphone that they can access. This now is the filter that I'm talking about. That's where now you start to see exclusion. So once you start disaggregating the data, you realize most registered suppliers are men, training participants are older, digital platforms users are urban or peri-urban. Then you now start to see who's missing. The irony is this hurts the company too, because the excluded groups are often the fastest growing farmers, especially if you look at young people who are being excluded, the most loyal workers, the most underutilized source of productivity. So when models unintentionally amplify exclusion, they don't just create social blind spots, they create commercial blind spots.
And you mentioned this digital aspect. And so we see gender issues evolving. And in the past, I've heard you reference the gender digital divide. For our audience, this divide is a gap we see between men and women in their access and benefit from digital technologies. As agribusinesses digitize, what new risks do you see emerging for women farmers? And why isn't digitization automatically inclusive?
So there's an assumption that digital is progress. And especially in Africa, it's really being touted that way. But digitization can actually amplify exclusion. Across Africa, women are significantly less likely to own smartphones. I've mentioned that. But I mean, even if I own a smartphone, it's probably hand-me-down from my husband, so it's worn out, some of the keys are not clear. Women are less likely to have mobile data, less likely to be comfortable using or navigating these complex apps. So if you roll out a digital platform without thinking about user diversity, what happens? The already connected benefit even more. The already marginalized fall further behind. So technology itself is neutral, but design choices are not. I once saw a client with a brilliant farmer app, but the entire interface assumed literacy. So English fluency, individual phone ownership. Guess who used it most? Exactly who was already empowered.
So what steps are we taking to correct the gender digital divide? This is such a big, evolving issue. How are we fixing it? What steps should others take?
Yeah, and I mean, when you want to reach millions of farmers, this is the way to do it. So what works is actually very practical. Design platforms with audio and local languages, offering group onboarding rather than individual-only models, working through trusted women's networks. We've seen women have very strong networks, no matter how small at the village level. Work through those networks. Collect sex disaggregator user data so we know who's actually using the system. Keep an eye on that data continuously. Across several IFC agribusiness projects in Africa, we increasingly encourage clients to treat inclusion as a design requirement, not a side activity, not as nice to have. And when they do, adoption improves dramatically.
So as we're wrapping up here, what's one thing, if our audience takes nothing else away, that you want people to keep in mind when they're thinking about gender inclusion?
The one thing I'd want people to remember is this. Most exclusion today is not driven by bad intent. It's driven by blind spots in how systems are designed. When we take time to ask, who might this system not be working for, we unlock enormous opportunity for businesses, for communities, for development outcomes. Inclusion is not an add-on. And I think it's been so politicized that we've forgotten what it is. And that's what I'm trying to bring us back to. It's a lens for better problem solving. The goal isn't to favor anyone. The goal is to finally see everyone who is already contributing. They're already there. Just see them.
And they deserve to be seen. Lydia, thank you so much for joining me today. Your perspective has been so invaluable. And to our audience, thank you so much for listening to the Agrileader podcast. Be sure to join us on our next episode for more insights and updates from ALP.